Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, starting with Chaf Tes Amud Beis, 5 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is discussing various shiurim, amounts that can be used for an Erev Techumim for various foods. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, Kol shehu liftan kedei le'echol boy. A liftan is something that you use to then eat together with bread. That amount that you would eat for 2 bread meals, that is enough to make for Erev Techumin. Kol she'einoi lifton kedei le'echol heimenu. But if it's not a lifton, something that's eaten with bread, then that amount that you would need to eat for a meal itself, 2 meals itself, would be the required amount for the Erev Techumin. Basar chai kedei le'echol heimenu. If it's raw meat, we're talking about raw meat that's enough, raw, maybe somewhat cooked, but it's raw enough where somebody still would eat it, then it's considered to be enough to make Erev Techumin, and you'd have to eat the amount that a person would eat raw meat for 2 meals. Basar tzli is a question. How about roasted meat? Is that considered to be a lifton, something that's eaten with bread, or is it eaten on its own? Rabba Omar kedei le'echol boy. Rabba says it's going to be like a lifton, what you would eat it together with bread. That would be the shear, the amount that would make it for an Erev Techumin. Rav Yosef Omar kedei le'echol heimenu. Rav Yosef argues and says, no, the amount that you would actually eat roasted meat for 2 meals, that's going to be the required amount for Erev Techumin. Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef, what do I know to say that the amount of roasted meat is not like a lifton, but rather you would eat it on its own? Dahane parsoi achle tavhoki below nahamo. Because the Persians, they are noheg to eat roasted meat in pieces of roasted meat alone without bread for their meals. Omar le'abaye uparsoi have ruba d'alma. You're going to bring a proof from the parsoim because they ate, the way they eat is they eat roasted meat alone for their meals. That's going to then be koveya the din for the rest of the world. V'hatnan big day anim la'anim big day hashim la'ashim. He brings a mishnah to disprove and say that you can't rely on the minhag of one makom because after all, big day anim, in regards to then the clothing, the cloth that an ani wears, what is going to be the minimum size that makes it so that it's going to be the kabel tuma? Sholosh al sholosh etzbois. Whereas a wealthy person's garment, he has a bigger shear. His minimum shear is shloisha al shlosha tfachim. So we see over here, says the Mishnah, it depends if it's an ani who has an ani's garment or a ashir. Because an ani will still get use out of the cloth, out of the clothing, even from something that is as small as shalosh or shalosh etzbois. The Gemara concludes its proof on Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph at the top. Aval big day ashirim le'anim loy. But when it comes to anim wearing big day ashirim, we don't say that it gets a higher shear of 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. No, it remains 3 etzbois by 3 etzbois. So you see that it doesn't make a difference at the fact that the ashirim then have a bigger shear. If the ani, it's his garment, that's what we then go basar. We go after the amount on the person on the way that they use it. So since the rest of the people in the world do not eat basar that is roasted as an entire meal without bread, then you cannot say then that's the required amount that a person needs to eat for his Erev Techumin. And if you will say that this is lechumra, the case of the cloth that we just stated now, the reason why when the ani uses the cloth of an ashir's clothing, we don't say it's the higher shear, but rather we're machmir and say even shalosh al shalosh etzbois will be also mekabel tuma. So you'll say also over here we're going lechumra, and we'll say that over here you'd have to have a greater amount of meat, of roasted meat, in order to then have the Erev Techumin sufficient to then be that amount, to be the required amount. V'hatanya, says the Gemara, If you're going to say that, Vatanya, it says in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Oimer, Me'arvin lechoyle ulezokein kidei mizoinoi. We make the Eruv Techumin based on the amount of food a zokein would eat specifically, which is less than the average person, and as well as the one who is ill, who eats less. His amount will be sufficient for making an Eruv Techumin for them. Uleravton, and for the glutton one, besuuda beinoinis shall kol adam. Whereas with the one who is glutton, who eats a lot, we'll say it's satisfactory to have the meal of a beinoni, of an average person. So we see over here that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar teaches us we go lakula when it comes to the amounts of food for tchumin. Gemara leaves it as a kasha. Take, it's a kasha on how Rav Yosef learns that roasted meat is indeed going to be required for the amount that you would eat, because the Persians, the Parsoin, they would eat it without eating bread. Says the Gemara, Umi Amar Rabbi Shimon Lazar Hachi. The Gemara challenges that which he just said, that when it comes to the glutton, we go to the smaller shear and say that we allow him to make Erev Techumin even in an average person's meal. Ask the Gemara, does that so that he goes lekula vehatanya? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Oimer oig melech haboshon pischoy kimloy. Here it's talking about when there's a dead body in a house, so it's metame the entire house as an oil. But the doorways, it depends on the size of the doorway. If the doorway is dalid al dalid tfochim, so we'll also metame those doorways that are dalid al dalid tfochim. If it has one doorway that's dalad dal tfachim and the other ones are less than dalad dal tfachim, then it'll only metame the doorway that's dalad dal tfachim, because that's the doorway that there's going to then take the mace out of. And if they have to widen, they'll widen that doorway because it's already larger than the other ones. If they are all less than dalad by dalad tfachim, then they will all become tamei. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, if you have a large body that will not fit through a regular doorway, and you have one doorway that's going to be large, beyond dalad al dalad tfachim, even if you have other doorways that are dalad al dalad tfachim, the only doorway that will be tamei is the one that's larger than dalad al tfachim, because the assumption is that this large body will then be taken out through that large doorway, whereby all the other doorways, again, even though they are dalad al dalad tfachim, will not be tamei. So that's how Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says. So you see that he's telling you that you go basa the specific person, the individual himself. So how can you say that the glutton before, who does eat much more than the average person, nonetheless his Erev Tchumin goes after the average person? Don't you see that you go from the individual, as we see over here in regards to what's stated in this brisa? Abaye explains over there it's different. In the case of the dead corpse, what can we do otherwise? Will we have to then cut off the limbs of the body in order to take him out? Of course, we'll have to take him out of the greatest, largest type of doorway. And therefore, that's why we say there, you go out in a case where it's greater than dalal tfachim, that will become tamei, and everything else will now not be tamei. Ask the Gemara, Iboilahu, Pligi Rabban Alei Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar or Loi? Does the Chachamim argue on the sheet of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in regards to what we said now, the glutton in regards to the dead body, if it's a large dead body, that indeed it goes through the largest doorway, which is tamei, and all the other doorways, even if they are dalad al dalad, will not become tamei? Toshma, let's bring a proof. Here, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, lefi the shita of the Chachamim, that if you have a large body, then it will also metame the Pesach of Dalid al Dalid. So you see that taka, this is going to then be a machlokes between Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Says the Gemara, no, it's not necessarily a machlokes, because hasam diika psochim ketanim tuva. There, in the case that we just quoted, where Rabbi Yochanan states that you'll go through the Dalid al Dalid, that's because it's talking about a case where there's many small entranceways. V'ikechad have arbo, and one of them is dalid al dalid. Devade ki marvech behu kamarvech. Therefore, the dalid al dalid entranceway, that's the one that you're going to widen to then bring out the large body, whereby that's why he says dalid al dalid is going to be tummy. Says the Gemara weiter, Omer Rab Chia bar Rav Ashi Omer Rav Ma'arvim beBasar Chai. As we said before, that Basar Chai, raw meat that is still edible, that can be used for your Erev Techumin. Omer Rav Simi bar Chia Ma'arvim beBeitzim Chayos, that you can use raw eggs for your Erev Techumin. V'kama, how many raw eggs is going to be necessary to make Erev Techumin? Omer Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok Sinai Oyim Amar Shtayim. Rav Yosef was known as Sinai because of his Bekius in Mishnayos and Braisos, and therefore he said two raw eggs is sufficient for your Erev Techumin. The Gemara now quotes the Mishnah that states that a person who makes a neder from Mazoin, so the Mayim and the Melach is not included in that neder. Says the Gemara, Melach u'mayim hu deloy ikri mazoin. When it comes to salt and water, they are not called mazoin, things that are considered to be sustenance, sustaining food. Hakol mili ikri mazoin, but all other items, food items, will be, yes, called sustaining foods. That would be the diuk that we have from the Mishnah. Ask the Gemara, Lema tihave tiyufta de Rav Shmuel. Let us suggest that this is going to be a tiyufta, a refutation on the opinion of Rav and Shmuel. The Rav Shmuel Damrei Travayu, because they both said, Ein mevarchim borei mine mizoynois, el al chameshes haminim bilvad. You do not make the bracha of borei mine mizoynois only on the 5 dogim, and therefore 5 degonim rather, on the 5 grains, and therefore, since they maintain that that's considered to be sustaining food, thereby other foods are not sustaining food, that must be then a contradiction, a refutation to what we're refuting what they said. Because our Mishnah states otherwise. Our Mishnah states that only melach and mayim are not sustenance rather, but all other foods are, yes, sustaining foods. Whereas Rav and Shmuel say only those coming from the 5 grains get the designation borei minei mizonos, because those are the foods that are sustaining. The Gemara says, "V'lav usvina chadazim." Did he not refute Rav and Shmuel separately, independently from this Mishnah? The Gemara says, "Leima tiyavtiyuftayu nami meha." Correct, but let us say there's also a refutation on Rav and Shmuel from here. Again, Rav and Shmuel state that the only time you make a bracha borei minei mizonos is a bracha on the 5 grains, and therefore all other foods are not considered to be sustaining sustenance foods. Yet our Mishnah states that all foods, the diuk is, are sustenance foods except for mayim and melach. Rav Huna be'oimer kol hazon alai. Rav Huna said, no, there's no refutation on Rav and Shmuel from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah doesn't say mazon, but rather he's making a neder of kol hazon alai. Hazon has the implication of all things that are satisfying to me, and those are the exception of that rule is mayim and melach. Whereas Rav and Shmuel are talking about mazon, which is sustenance foods. Mayim and melach hu deloy zaini. It's water and salt that are not satisfying, do not satiate the person. But the diuk is then all other foods do satiate. As the Gemara, V'ha'omar Rabbi barachano, ki havaz lina basrei Rabbi Yochanan lemeichal peri deginosar. When I would go behind Rabbi Yochanan, would I follow him to then go to the area where he would eat the fruits of Geinosar. Geinosar was in the north, near the Tiberia area of Eretz Yisrael, where they had delicious sweet fruits. The Gemara in Brachos in the 6th parak speaks about those fruits. He explains, Ki avina be'meya hava menaktinon l'chol chad v'chad asara asara. When we were 100 that were going together with Rabbi Yochanan, each one would take 10 fruits, which would be a total of 1,000. 1,000 fruits altogether. Ki havina be'asora, when 10 of us would then go with Rav Yochanan, have menachtinon lekol chad v'chad mea me'el. We would all take 100 fruits each. Again, a total of 1,000 fruits. V'chol mea minayihu, and all 100 fruits, lo have machzik lutzana bas tlosasave. And every 100 fruits would not even be able to be fit into a basket the size of 3 saw. And Rav Yochanan ate all of these fruits. And he declared the following oath: I didn't eat foods that are satiating. That means that we see from this that the fruits that he ate don't have the designation of being satiating fruits, that are satisfying fruits. And yet we just said that all foods from our Mishnah Diuk are satisfying, with the exception of Melach and Mayim. Answers the Gemara, Ema Mizoina. When he made this oath, he said sustaining types of foods. He didn't say satisfying foods. That means he was satisfied from the fruits that he ate. Only he was saying they're not sustaining types of food. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav the following statement in regards to making an oath. Shvua shaloi oichal kikar zu. If a person made a shvua that he will not eat this loaf of bread, ma'arvin loi ba. We will allow him to make an eruv with that loaf, because he only made an oath that he cannot eat from it, but he could, yes, benefit in other ways, in this case making an eruv with it. But he will not be able to eat from this loaf of bread, but somebody else will be able to eat from the loaf of bread, just like our Mishnah stated in regards to the Nazir, that the Nazir who himself cannot drink wine, nonetheless, he can make an eruv with the wine because somebody else can drink the wine. Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, goes on to say, Kikar zu alai, if he made a shvua of this kikar is going to be upon me, Asr, then he's saying that all things, not only eating, will be prohibited to me. And therefore, ein ma'arvin loiba. Therefore, he cannot use this loaf of bread for an eruv techumin. Meisvei asked the Gemara on this statement, the latter statement of Rav Huna Merav, that when he says kikar zu alai, you cannot use this kikar for eruv. Hanoider mina kikar, it states in the Brisa, one who makes a neder from a kikar, a bread, ma'arvin loibo. He could, yes, make an eruv with it. My love, the Omar alai, is it not that he's saying that the kikar alai, I don't have any benefit from this kikar? And still the Brisa states you can, yes, use it for an eruv techumin. Says the Gemara, loy, the Omar zu. He says this kikar, and therefore referring to the fact that he cannot eat it. And therefore he could, yes, use it as an eruv techumin. But in a chanami, according to Rav Huna Rav, if he said a lie, he cannot use that kikar for his tchumin. Hochanam mistaber, the Gemara now says it's mistaber to say like this, because Diktani, it states in the seif of this brisa, when is it so that when a person says that he is making a shvua, that he's making a shvua that he can go ahead and use the bread for an eruv. When he says, I cannot taste the bread as a food. Diuk aval omar alai mai. But if he did say omar alai, he said a shvu of alai, the kikar is also to me alai, meaning even on other things, hachanami de emarvin loibo. Then we can say that indeed, from this diuk, that he would not be able to use it as an eruv, just as Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. Ihochi, now the Gemara challenges this, that the Brisa, the Gemara challenges, is this true that it goes and fits with the sheet of Rav Huna? Ihochi, if it's so, that the Brisa does mean this, then Kikar zu hektish, when the Brisa goes on to say, in the latter part of the Brisa, that Kikar zu is hektish, it's consecrated. In other words, it is hekdesh and it's off limits because it's aser bahano, then ein ma'arvin loy ba. You cannot use it as your eruv. Lefisha ein ma'arvin behekdeshos, because you cannot use eruv for things that are consecrated. It's aser bahano. If so, what we said before is true, then lifloy v'lisni b'didei. Let it also then distinguish and teach within itself. In other words, why do we have to go to a case in the safe of this brisa of hekdesh? Let's talk within the shvua that a private person makes, and make the distinction as follows. Bamed means between zu and alai. Zu is yes mutter, alai is aser. Bamed v'ramurim do omar zu. When is it so that I can go ahead and make erev techumin with this kikar when he makes a shvua of zu? Aval omar alai, when he makes a shvua of kikar alai, then ein ma'arvin loy ba. So we should make a distinction and teach within that itself. Why does the brisa have to then schlep to a case of hekdesh? Omar lach Rav Huna. Rav Huna will say to you, to defend himself from this brisa, elamai kol heicha de omar alai ma'arvin. So what does it mean when it says omar alai, and you could make ma'arvin? In other words, kasher reisha. That's a difficulty in the ratio. In other words, the diuk that we made before, when the Gemara brings from the Brisa, Eimosai bisman she'omar shvua shelo etamena, he makes a shvua that I will not taste it. On that we said is going to be valid to use for tchumin. And we made a diuk though, and we said, but if he says alai, then it would be osir. Ask Rav Huna, what are you going to say about that diuk? Answers the Gemara, that's not going to be a question, because Chisui mechsera v'hochiktani. The brisa was missing words, and this is how you have to learn the brisa. Hanoider min hakikar. A person takes a neder from the kikar. Na'arvin loiba. You can go ahead and make an eruv techumin with that. V'afilu omar alai. And even if he says alai, these are the words that we're missing. It's like making a shvur that I will not taste it, and therefore it's a valid way that you can go ahead and use still this kikar for erev techumin. Mikol makom kasha l'Rav Huna. Nonetheless, so now we're left with a kasha on Rav Huna. In other words, Rav Huna said that when you say the shvur alai in the kikar, then you cannot use it for techumin. But the brisa is then contradicting him. So it's a kasha on Rav Huna. Answers the Gemara, Huda Omer Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Huna, he has another Tana that he follows, Rabbi Eliezer, as follows, the Tanya. Rabbi Eliezer oimer shvua shaloi oichel kikar zu. A person who makes a shvua that he will not eat this kikar, ma'arvin loibo. Then you can use it for tchumin, because he said he's not going to eat the kikar, but you can use it, go ahead, for tchumin. Kikar zu alai, but if he says kikar zu upon me, so that includes other things, not just for eating. Ein ma'arvin loibo. Then you cannot use it for your eruv. So here you have Rav Huna going together with Rabbi Eliezer in this brisa. Ask the Gemara, did Rabbi Eliezer really hold this way? Umi Omar Rabbi Eliezer Hochi. We have Rabbi Eliezer recorded differently somewhere else. Vehatanya. Zeh haklal. Adam oiser atzmoi beoichel. The klal is a person can prohibit himself with a food, ma'arvin loibo, and you still use it for erev techumin. Oichel hanesar loy la'adam. But if he says the oichel is also to him, which seems to imply all things, then ein ma'arvin loibo. He is not permitted to use it for techumin. That's the Tanakama. Rabbi Eliezer oimer kikar zu alai ma'arvin loibo. He says you could use it. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer is of the shita that even though you said alai, it seems to see in this recording of this brisa, that Rabbi Eliezer says when you say alai, then even though you said that the kikar is prohibited to me in all, seems to be all aspects, he says you could use it for eruv. How can you use it for eruv? Because mitzvahs lav lehonois nitna. In other words, even though you cannot get any hana from this kikar, but since he's going to be using it for eruv techum, which is a mitzvah, it's not considered to be something getting hana from, and therefore, Shittas Rabbi Eliezer over here says that you could use this kikar that you said alai with, and use it as your eruv techumin. Kikar zu hekdesh. If you say hekdesh, however, that's consecrated, then ein ma'arvin lo bo. The fisha ein ma'arvin lo behekdeshos. So we're left with a contradiction. You just said that Rabbi Huna goes like the Shita Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer says when you say Harei Alai, then it's going to be invalid to make Erev Techumin. But this recording of Rabbi Eliezer says that Rabbi Eliezer holds differently. That he says when you say Alai, you can use it for your Techumin. Answers the Gemara, Trei Tanoi va'alibad Rabbi Eliezer. There are two different Tanoim in the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer.